Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
From early childhood, Julia decided girls are either beautiful or smart. She knew she could choose, and she chose to be smart. She had the example of her older sister Angelina right before her eyes. Everyone around admired Angelina's beauty. How could they not, with her light brown, silky hair, green, mermaid-like eyes, and a figure that could be called model-like? Angelina had been focused solely on her looks since her early years. She read a lot, but these were fashion magazines with makeup tips, diets, and so on. Her friends were just the same. Julia considered them pretty but frivolous fools. Their mother, single-handedly raising two daughters, had high hopes for the elder one. "You'll marry well, Angela, and we'll live well." Julia was still a little girl then, in 4th or 5th grade. She couldn't understand how one could place the responsibility for their happiness and well-being on someone else. Didn't her mother, who had been burnt herself, draw the right conclusions? One day, Juliet asked her mother directly, "You married Dad for his money too, right? And he left us, went to a younger and more beautiful woman. He left nothing for you or the children because she had good appetites. And now you're teaching Angela the same, so she ends up the same way. Don't jinx it." Her mother flailed her hands. "Angela is different. First, she's young. Second, she's much more beautiful than me, and after all, she has me. I had to figure everything out on my own, but I will guide her, teach her everything. Everything will be fine for Angela, and for you too, if you listen to me." Julia just sighed heavily then. Her mother was beautiful and kind, but far too frivolous. Both her mother and Angela lived with rose-colored glasses on their eyes. Everyone dreamed of a beautiful life, believing that appearance was the defining factor of success for a woman, and so on. Julia was different from her peers in character. She was always pragmatic, responsible, far-sighted, and she clearly understood, to achieve something in life, one must work hard. The options her mother and sister had in mind, wealthy men, benefactors, were unreliable, fragile, and illusory. Angela jokingly called her younger sister a bore. The mother constantly tried to change Julia, to impose her own point of view on her daughter. Interestingly, the mother sincerely believed she wished her child well. "I worry about your future. How can you not understand? You turned out such a beauty. You took the best from me and your father. When you finish school, we'll find you a wealthy suitor. Just don't be so dull, men like cheerful and smiling women." "No, thank you. After school, I'm going to study economics," Julia replied. "Oh, you know how competitive that is?" Angela always argued at this point. "There you need to be either very smart or have good connections." "Yes," the mother sighed. "We can't afford commercial education, and you won't get in for free." But Julia, trying not to listen to her sister's and mother's arguments, pursued her goal. She spent day and night over textbooks, searching for additional courses online, mostly free, as her mother, working as a cashier in a local supermarket, had no money for her daughter's education, and the father was almost uninvolved in the children's lives, having a new family. He did send some nominal alimony, but that was the extent of it. No communication, support, or help in difficult situations. Julia knew from childhood not to count on him. Deep down, she wanted to meet and talk to her father at least once. She felt she might be like him in character because she was nothing like her mother and Angelina. But he never sought out his daughters, and Julia didn't want to impose herself. Moreover, she was afraid of facing the indifference or, worse, the dislike of her own kin. Her father was a businessman, owning a chain of stores. He seemed to make good money, but all his assets were cleverly registered in his new wife's name, so his ex-wife and children couldn't claim anything. This looked petty, mean, even despicable. Ideally, Julia should have been as offended by her father as her mother and Angelina were, but she had a dream, to study economics, start her own business, and one day meet her father over some business matter, a joint project, a profitable contract, something like that. Let him see what his daughter achieved on her own, without his help. Maybe then, they could talk as equals. And Julia achieved her goal. She got into the budget of that very economics faculty she aimed for. She was overjoyed to see her name on the list of admitted students, screaming in front of the computer screen, jumping to the ceiling in happiness. Have you lost your mind? Angela peeked into the room with little Yin in her arms. Angela had recently become a mother, having a son with a wealthy man. He dutifully paid child support, but he had little desire to interact with the child's mother or even Yin himself. Needless to say, the child support was minimal. Standard scheme, gray wage, most earnings hidden. Angela had indeed repeated her mother's fate, in an even worse version, but she didn't give up and continued to dream of a prince who would eventually solve all her financial problems. The mother supported the elder daughter in everything. She adored her grandson, which was unsurprising. Julia also enjoyed spending time with the little boy when she had the chance. But the girl couldn't understand how one couldn't learn from what happened. Wasn't it clear that the plan wasn't too good and often failed from the very beginning? It was time to choose another option. But no, Angela was still hanging out on dating sites, searching for bigger prey. I got in, Julia explained her strange behavior to her sister. Wow, cool. Does that mean you're moving out? Going to the city to study? Julia's family also lived in a city, albeit a very small one, far from the regional center. Gray 3-story buildings, entire streets of old wooden barracks, a vast private sector. Officially not a village, but in reality. Thus, Walnuts, the regional capital where Julia's university was located, was referred to as the city. The mother was also happy to learn about the younger daughter's admission. She hadn't hoped for such a thing, as it turned out. She thought, let the younger one show off, and when she realizes it didn't work out, she'll follow in her mother's footsteps, work at the supermarket cashier, and finally ponder the words of more experienced relatives, realizing one should look for a wealthy and reliable man. And look how it turned out, she got admitted. Well done, daughter, the mother hugged the younger one. I'll help you as best I can. I can't send much money, sorry, but I'll find a little bit for your living expenses. You also need to dress nicely. In a big city, you have more chances to meet a decent person. Mom, are you starting again? Julia smiled. She was touched that her mother supported and understood her and even offered help. Julia knew these funds were not easy for her mother to come by, but she was ready to help her daughter while she was still a student, and this was priceless. Julia started a new life. She was given a room in the student dormitory, though not a private one. She had to share the space with 2 girls, but the roommates turned out to be very pleasant. Both were studying at the Pedagogical Institute and, like Julia, were focused on study and work. The girls had a lot in common. Julia even became friends with one of these roommates, Paula. They maintained their relationship even after each had graduated from their respective universities and moved into rented apartments. Julia enjoyed her studies. From the first year, she was convinced she had chosen the right direction. Economic sciences came easily to her. Lectures seemed interesting, and coursework and exams incredibly easy. Julia even started earning money. It turned out that people were willing to pay good for essays and projects. Good by Julia's standards, of course. The girl had to work part-time and study a lot. She had no time for student parties, club outings, and similar entertainments. Sometimes she wanted to have fun and relax, but she understood every minute was precious. Her time was too valuable. Moreover, there wasn't much money. Her mother tried her best, topping up her daughter's card with a small amount each month. Julia knew this was a significant part of her mother's salary and was very grateful for it. It was little, very little, but still, her mother's help allowed Julia to stay afloat. Especially after the 3rd year, when something changed in the university and students were required to pay for the dormitory. Previously, it had been free. Julia economized on almost everything, but she didn't get discouraged. She knew she was working towards her goal. Sooner or later, everything would be good, just as she had dreamed. But around New Year's, an event occurred that made Julia reconsider her plans and turned her life upside down. It happened during that hectic time before New Year's when students are trying to pass all their debts so they can start the winter session after the holidays without any troubles. Julia was preparing for an exam in the history of economics when her sister called. Angelina's photo appeared on the screen, smiling broadly, looking like a star. Julia immediately understood something had happened. Angela wouldn't just call her at 3 in the morning. It was Julia who was up, preparing for exams, while her sister should have been deep in her 7th dream. "Mom is in a trouble," Angelina's ringing voice came through the phone. She seemed close to hysterics. "Come quickly." "What happened?" Julia felt her limbs go cold, and her stomach suddenly felt very empty. Anxiety gripped her heart with an icy, rough hand. "She's been hit by a bus." "What? When? Is she alive?" But getting coherent answers from Angela was impossible. She was crying and sobbing into the phone, dropping only disjointed, insignificant phrases. Mostly, these were laments about how scared and bad she felt now. Apparently, the accident had happened in the evening, but Angelina was only informed just now, literally a couple of minutes ago, and she immediately called her sister. Of course, there was no longer any talk of debts or exams at that moment. Early in the morning, Julia took the first ride home. At the bus station at such an early hour, she was almost the only passenger. She found her sister in a terrible state, disheveled hair, a face swollen from tears. She was holding her younger daughter, the little Michaela, in her arms. Angelina was already a mother of many children. The eldest son Yen, then 2 girls, Carolina and Michaela, born close together. None of the fathers took part in raising the children. The princes, sons of wealthy parents, refused to raise offspring and got off with minimal alimony. With Angelina, they just had fun, not intending anything serious, while she kept stepping on the same trap, getting pregnant deliberately in hopes of finding a happy, strong family. "If something happens to her, how will I manage with them alone?" Angelina looked at Julia with lost eyes, as if expecting her to offer a solution, but Julia. At that moment, she was ready to hit her sister. It was unknown what had happened to their mother, and she was only thinking about herself. How did it happen? They had a corporate party, Angelina hurriedly spoke, mechanically rocking her daughter. They must have drunk there. They told me that Mom was crossing the road in an improper place. She jumped out right in front of the bus. The driver couldn't do anything. He's in shock now, too, in the hospital. Had a heart attack right there on the spot. By the time they figured it all out, they called me late at night, and I called you right away. So Mom's alive? Julia clarified, as it was most important for her. Which hospital is she in? Froston. Julia rushed out of the house, calling a taxi on the go. She had to get there as soon as possible, had to understand what happened to her kin. At the hospital, Julia was told terrible news. Her mother was no longer there. She had passed away just recently, at the moment when Julia was rushing to the clinic. Everything happened in the ICU. The doctor later said that there were no chances for a good outcome, the injuries were too severe, and Julia wouldn't have been able to say goodbye to her mother anyway. She was in a coma. And yet, the girl blamed herself for not being quick enough, for not holding her mother's hand while she was still. Julia was signing some papers when crying Angela called her. Someone from the medical staff had informed her, and now the older sister was close to panic. It was a difficult time. Organizing the funeral, trying to bring her sister back to her senses, who had to take care of her little ones no matter what, and gradually realizing the terrible fact, the most dear and close person in the world was no longer there. Just gone. Their father didn't show up at the funeral, although he couldn't have been unaware of what had happened. The man didn't even call his daughters, didn't try to understand if they needed his help. Probably, he considered them adults already. Both were over 18, so legally the father no longer owed them anything. He had faithfully paid alimony until the daughter's adulthood, and nothing more was to be expected. That was when Julia realized that she wouldn't meet or talk to this person even when she reached career heights. They, Angela and her mother, were not needed by him, and he was not needed by them. There was no resentment. Julia just suddenly realized that her father was a complete stranger. Maybe they were alike in some ways, but the father was a stranger, simply a stranger, and that was period. But Angela was her blood, and she needed support. Angelina cried nonstop for several days, and Julia didn't stop her. Let her cry it out. It would be easier for her that way. While her sister coped with her grief, Julia helped her with the nephew and nieces. The children, even in such a dire situation, made her smile. It was impossible to remain indifferent to their funny games and listen to their sweet babbling. The nephew and nieces, more than anything else, showed Julia that life goes on. Julia couldn't stay with her sister for long, winter session. And Angelina had already come to her senses a bit, even started browsing dating sites again. Now she wanted even more for a mature, supportive person to be by her side. Their mother was no longer there. Julia, despite everything, passed the session with flying colors. This meant a higher scholarship. However, these funds were not even enough for a month's rent of a room. The dormitory had become paid. And she still needed to eat, dress, pay for transportation. Julia tried to combine studying and working in a cafeteria. It turned out to be impossible. She quickly accumulated a lot of absences and debts. In the end, she didn't even get permission for the next session. Dismissal loomed ahead. The teachers took into account her previous achievements and met her halfway, but she still couldn't cope. The only solution was to transfer to a correspondence course. But here's the catch: all budget places were taken, and the commercial option cost an astronomical amount for Julia. The rector offered a way out. One day he called Julia to him and suggested the only option he thought suitable. "I know your situation, wouldn't wish it on an enemy," the man began, always reminding Julia of Winnie the Pooh, just as kind-hearted, plump, and short. "You're a diligent, promising student. I want to help you, so I will pass you in the session no matter what. Let's put some C grades. Take a year off for academic leave, I'll facilitate it, due to family circumstances. Get a job, save money for your studies. You can do it, you're a goal-oriented person. Then you'll resume your studies, and I'll help you with all the nuances. What do you think?" Julia thought about it. She didn't want to interrupt her studies. On the other hand, what other options did she have? The session was definitely not passed. So, dismissal? And where to go? Go back home to the parents' apartment? But there's already Angela's new suitor living there, a young and seemingly good guy, Alfredo. Unlike Angela's previous admirers, he's not a rich major. The guy works on construction, works hard from dawn to dusk, earns a living. He seems to really love Angela and has accepted all her children. Maybe they will really have a family. Julia would be completely superfluous there, and she herself didn't want to live with her sister. No, Julia loved her very much. She was the only relative in the whole world, and still. Julia was used to peace, solitude, freedom. And there was a large family. It wouldn't work out there. And in the end, she didn't want to leave Walnuts. It's a big city, beautiful, spacious, interesting. There are more opportunities for work and study. The small town where Julia's childhood passed was associated with grayness and hopeless melancholy. No, she didn't want to return there at all. "You know, I think I'll take you up on your offer," Julia smiled at the rector. "That's my girl," the man beamed. "You're doing great, everything will work out for you. Just don't forget to save up for your studies. Make sure you come back to the university after a year. We'll be waiting for you, agreed?" "Agreed. Thank you so much for the offer." That same evening, Julia began looking for a job. She urgently needed money, just to survive, to buy food, to pay for a roof over her head. The most effective motivation there is. It turned out to be nearly impossible for her to find something close to her desired profession with her unfinished higher education. Julia was rejected everywhere. Employers wouldn't even consider candidates without a diploma. She understood that she could have proved herself in an interview, but she never even got that far. After a few days of fruitless searching, Julia realized it was time to let go of her dream of being an economist, at least for now, and find anything she could. Once she lowered her standards, things went better. There were plenty of job options for Julia: waitress, cleaner, salesperson. True, the salaries offered were meager. Yes, it was enough to live on, especially if she was frugal, but Julia needed to save up for her studies in a year, and with such salaries, this was impossible. Still, Julia urgently needed a job. She chose to be a waitress in a bar in the city center. There were enough reasons for this choice. First, there was extra pay for night shifts. Second, the tips were very helpful, sometimes even generous. Third, shift work allowed Julia to write coursework and control papers for others, extra money in the piggy bank, and her brain was active, all positives. Julia even liked working at the bar. The team was friendly and united, the management was lenient, and the clientele was decent. It was a rock bar, and the owners cared about their reputation. They maintained the atmosphere, and undesirable elements were expelled by security and not allowed back. And there was more. Every evening, musicians gathered here, local bands and visiting guests. In short, live music, and it was wonderful. Julia enjoyed listening to the musicians, singing along, dancing. This was encouraged in the bar. Going to work like going to a festival. At the bar, Julia finally understood the meaning of this common phrase. Of course, a waitress's salary doesn't allow for much saving. Julia was still looking for another job, higher paying, but she knew that even when she had to quit, she would come here as a guest, just to be in this wonderfully warm atmosphere. The rock bar and new friends helped Julia get through her grief. Of course, the longing for her mother didn't disappear, but she was finally able to return to life and believe that there was still a lot of good ahead. It was in this rock bar that Julia met Gustavo. One evening, the host introduced a new rock band that had formed just a couple of months ago. Gustavo was the bassist, but not only that. It was his idea to create the group. He wrote the songs and the music. Modest, always in the background, but constantly observing everything, the behavior of the band members, the reaction of the audience. Gustavo was the leader of the team, although on stage the vocalist attracted most of the attention. This was noticeable, evident from the first glance. Julia somehow immediately singled him out and was drawn to him. She didn't recognize herself. Julia perfectly understood that she was not in a position to fall in love and start romances. She was focused on her career, on her studies, on getting back into university. She couldn't afford to be distracted by all this, and yet, Gustavo didn't joke around or flirt with the waitresses, and he never started conversations with anyone first. He was serious, focused on his business. Perhaps that's what appealed to Julia. Gustavo was very much like her. Gustavo started showing up at the bar often, sometimes with the band to work, sometimes just to hang out with friends. Of course, they soon met, but he still remained somewhat distant. He didn't show open affection, though sometimes Julia caught his gaze on her. However, Gustavo would immediately look away, starting a conversation with someone else, and Julia wished he would pay attention to her, compliment her, show signs of interest, as other customers often did. And then Julia would have let him know that he interested her. One day, a girl was with Gustavo's company. Yes, women had come with him before, but they were just friends, girlfriends of other band members, and this one. There was clearly something between her and Gustavo. They didn't kiss or hug, nothing like that, but sometimes they exchanged tender looks and smiled warmly at each other. Once she even laid her head on his shoulder, and Gustavo, usually cold and even stern, stroked her hair with a natural and very gentle gesture, as if she were a kitten. Julia felt a very unpleasant sensation stirring in her chest. She immediately recognized it: jealousy. With surprising meticulousness, Julia began to look for flaws in her rival: too thin, even scrawny, unattractive, long nose, hair too thin. In short, this lady was no match for her, for Julia. For the first time in her life, Julia felt a sense of self-satisfaction because of her appearance. Nature had endowed her, like Angela, with beauty. Julia had often heard compliments from others about her figure: tall, slim, long-legged. Her friends even collectively advised her to try her hand at a modeling agency. But that job was not to Julia's liking. She didn't know how to show herself off, even found it somewhat humiliating. And yet, despite such impressive physical attributes, her rival for Gustavo was just an ordinary girl. There was nothing outstanding about Gustavo's companion, nothing eye-catching. Nevertheless, he obviously had very tender feelings for her. Her presence made him happy. Julia observed Gustavo closely and could say for sure: he loved his companion. It hurt. Thanks to the girl who clung to Gustavo, Julia made up her mind. She decided to do something she had previously considered unacceptable for herself. Her shift was almost over, but as usual, she stayed to help a waitress friend serve tables. A busy Saturday evening, many customers. Julia waited for the right moment. She even drank a little beforehand for courage, to feel more confident and relaxed. Gustavo stood up and headed for the exit. Someone had called him. The music in the bar was loud, making it impossible to talk on the phone. Everyone went out, some to the street, to the bar's porch, some to the smoking area. Gustavo chose the street. Julia followed him like a shadow, now or never. The unpleasant girl, who had been sitting next to Gustavo all evening, stayed at the table. She was chatting cheerfully with his friends. It was obvious that they all knew each other well. Probably, these were long and serious relationships, but still. Julia would try, otherwise. Otherwise, she would regret later that she didn't. Gustavo stepped onto the porch. He walked around, patiently explaining something to someone. Julia watched him through the large window on the door. Gustavo wasn't smiling or joking. Clearly, the conversation was serious or unpleasant, but it didn't matter. Julia would still approach him as soon as. Gustavo pressed end call and was about to return to the bar when Julia approached him. Fortunately, they were alone on the porch at that moment. "Hi," Julia smiled at him. "Hi." Gustavo looked at her with interest. "Haven't we already greeted each other?" "Yes, we have," Julia nodded. I need to talk to you." Gustavo immediately stopped and prepared himself for the conversation. His whole demeanor showed he was ready to listen to his interlocutor. He could have brushed her off or shown irritation or dissatisfaction, but Gustavo looked at her with his dark, intelligent eyes and waited. You've been on my mind for a long time," Julia decided to get straight to the point. I don't know how to explain it. I'm drawn to you, like a magnet. This has never happened to me before. I don't know what to do with all this." Julia lowered her eyes. There, she had said it. What now? Gustavo was probably looking for words to brush her off as politely as possible. Most likely, that's what was happening. Julia suddenly felt unbearably ashamed of her action. Why did she approach him? How could she look him in the eye after all this? Gustavo often comes to the bar. And then Julia felt his hands on her shoulders, a gentle touch, as if she was some incredibly fragile vessel. Julia. Her own name, falling from Gustavo's lips, sounded like beautiful music to her. Julia, I couldn't even imagine something like this. Gustavo was looking at her and smiling. He rarely smiled. His eyes, Julia clearly saw, shone with happiness, genuine, real. What's happening? Was he happy about her confession? Instead of words, Gustavo kissed Julia. Her head spun with all of it. He was holding her, more precisely, even supporting her, because her legs were almost giving out, kissing her, then stroking her back and head, gently pressing her to himself. I've been watching you for a long time too, and I'm drawn to you just the same. Then why? I didn't notice anything at all. I thought you didn't care. I didn't want to embarrass you needlessly. And besides, I'm older, too old for you. I thought you were attracted to entirely different guys, rugged, successful. With your looks, anything's possible. You're an unreal beauty. You even inspired me to write a song. Didn't you realize that Elven Princess is about you? No, admitted Julia. It's a very beautiful song, I like it. I never thought that. That it appeared thanks to you? Well, yes, but... And that girl who came with you, are you together? Together? Gustavo couldn't help but smile. We've been together since our parents brought a bundle tied with a pink ribbon from the maternity ward and told me that Lumina is my sister. So she's your sister? Julia laughed out loud. And here I thought, that's why I decided to have this talk today. Sister, that's for sure. Gustavo held Julia tighter and inhaled the scent of her hair. Just passing through the city. She's been married for a long time, lives far away with her husband. Just missed her good-for-nothing brother. Julia and Gustavo started dating. It turned out that all this time he had a soft spot for the beautiful waitress. Why hadn't he made any moves towards her? He planned to, but later, when he had more financial freedom. He had a clear notion in his mind, girls aren't interested in losers. There was too much going on with the band, organizing performances, and so on. But the guys were already starting to earn money with their songs. The prospects were looking good. Surprisingly for a rock musician, Gustavo was shy when it came to interacting with girls. Sure, he had many female friends to chat and laugh with. But Julia, she evoked special feelings in him, making Gustavo, accustomed to performing in front of hundreds, feel timid. But Julia made the first move, dispelling all of Gustavo's doubts. And now they were together. Gustavo himself suggested they move in together. They decided to choose Julia's apartment for living, convenient location, reasonable cost, cozy room. So, it turned out that Gustavo moved in with her. But he immediately took over the rent payment and minor repairs, which every dwelling periodically needs. It also turned out that Gustavo was an excellent cook. Julia's culinary talents simply paled in comparison to his expertise. Gustavo, as befits a creative person, created real masterpieces, both in the recording studio and in the kitchen. He was gentle, caring, attentive, fully immersed in creativity, but never forgetting about his loved one. They talked a lot, often went for walks, and sometimes discussed Gustavo's next song that was swirling in his head and about to be born. Sometimes Julia would suggest the right phrase or word to her beloved. He would joyfully seize the idea, and then she would feel proud of herself. After all, she had participated in the creation of a hit. Julia completely immersed herself in her feelings and new sensations. Before meeting Gustavo, she didn't know what it was like to love a man. She didn't have time for that. First, there was diligent studying, then attempts to survive. It turns out it's so nice to be next to someone who hugs you, cares about your mood and well-being, looks at you with admiring eyes as if you were a princess, and melt at the touch of warm, strong hands, knowing that this tall man with dark eyes is ready to do everything for you. Angela didn't approve of her sister's choice. As always, she approached everything with her own standard. He's poor, isn't he? He doesn't even have his own apartment. Not to mention a stable job or a business. He's a musician, he has his own rock band. Well, so what? Who needs them anyway? These one-hit wonder groups, a dime a dozen. Will they find success? It's uncertain. I think you've placed your bet on the wrong horse. With your looks. You're going about it the wrong way. As for me, I have 3 kids. Who needs me? That's the way it is. I don't complain and use what life gives me, but you. However, Julia didn't expect her sister to understand her. They had always been too different, but Julia didn't need understanding. She was happy, loved, she had found a dear and close person. Yes, Gustavo was going through a difficult period, but he was trying, working towards his goal, working hard, looking for the right contacts, planning things. Julia supported him in all his endeavors, and he appreciated her devotion, often saying that he was grateful to fate for such a gift for her. One day Gustavo embarked on a rather risky venture. He invited a famous rock band to Walnuts. It was planned that his band would perform as an opening act for the renowned musicians. This event was supposed to increase the popularity of Gustavo's group. Moreover, organizing such concerts was a way to earn a decent amount of money. But something went wrong. The concert didn't attract as many viewers as planned. There was a big rock festival in a neighboring region. Gustavo hadn't considered this. More accurately, he learned about the festival too late, when everything was already in motion. In the end, Gustavo went into a significant deficit. Paying the musicians, renting the hall and equipment, tickets for the rock group, promotional activities, all this was only half covered by the money earned from ticket sales. The concert itself went great, but Gustavo ended up with huge debts that needed to be paid off as soon as possible. But how? Julia found it hard to watch her beloved during this period. He looked lost, troubled. She wanted to help him somehow, but how? Where would Julia get such money? Gustavo took a loan, but it was only a drop in the ocean. His friends helped, and the situation improved, but the debt remained quite substantial. Then Julia offered her help. She had savings, the money she had set aside for her studies. Not much, of course, but still. Additionally, she did what she had long opposed. She took out a consumer loan. These funds were enough to cover the debt. Where did this come from? Gustavo was surprised when Julia handed him several packs of crisp new bills. Well, someone unexpectedly paid back a debt to me, plus the insurance finally paid out for my mom's case, Julia lied. She knew that if she told Gustavo the truth, he would never take the money from her. But this way, it seemed like it wasn't her last dime, just some unexpected windfall. Thank you, Gustavo hugged Julia tightly. I'll pay it all back, you'll see. We'll be famous soon, and I'll pay it all back. Gustavo paid off the debt and continued to develop the band. Julia slowly paid off the loan. Saving for her studies was no longer possible. Moreover, her salary suddenly became much lower. The bar was not having its best times. Luckily, Gustavo bought groceries and paid the apartment rent, taking on the main part of the expenses. Gustavo's income consisted of money from infrequent performances at corporate events and odd jobs. Not a stable income, but still a steady trickle, sometimes lean, sometimes plentiful. Julia didn't worry about the financial side of their relationship. She enjoyed Gustavo's attention, basked in his love and care, and generously gave him tenderness, love, and support. She tried not to think too much about the future. If she couldn't return to university this year, she would do it next year. No big deal. She still had time. The main thing was that Gustavo was with her. Julia hadn't known before that she was capable of such feelings. And then Gustavo disappeared. No, he didn't run away from Julia, and nothing terrible happened to him. It all started as a business trip. Can you believe it? Gustavo grabbed Julia by the shoulders, even shaking her slightly. His eyes shone like two bright spotlights. Can you believe it? I've been invited to the USA to write music for a band. They found me online, liked what I do, and now they're inviting me. Julia couldn't believe her ears. She knew the band Gustavo was talking about. They were very popular musicians, touring the world, and they noticed Gustavo. They were offering him a collaboration. Incredible. I'll have to leave for a while, Gustavo continued. Do you understand what this means? Julia nodded. She understood: money, fame, dizzying opportunities for Gustavo's growth and development as a musician, useful connections. Gustavo would get what he had never even dared to dream of, but it seemed they would have to part for an indefinite time. As Gustavo clearly said, I have to leave. Not we. Preparations began. Gustavo had numerous issues to sort out. First, he needed to find someone to temporarily replace him in his band. Second, he dealt with passport and visa arrangements. Third, there was the packing of necessary items. In all this hustle, he seemed to completely forget about Julia. Gustavo was too engrossed in the upcoming changes and the opportunities that lay ahead. Julia watched him and understood he would forget about her. He would forget, amidst the new experiences and inspirations, working and succeeding in a different country. Maybe Gustavo would even find someone there. But Gustavo, he embraced her so tenderly in the evenings, sincerely assuring her that he would miss her. Time will fly by. Besides, we have video calls, we'll stay in constant touch. Plus, I'll finally earn some decent money, pay back the debt to you. I know you need it. Maybe we'll even buy an apartment. My band will get noticed. I'll gain invaluable experience there, understand the ins and outs. Everything will be fine. Gustavo truly believed this. Julia saw he was not lying or pretending. But something told her everything would change as soon as her beloved was abroad. Gustavo himself hadn't realized it yet. And that's exactly how it turned out. At first, Gustavo called every day, as promised, telling her how he was settling in at the new place. Everything thrilled him, his experiences were overwhelming. But then, he suddenly vanished. He stopped calling and didn't answer Julia's calls. The long beeps consistently ended with a message that the subscriber was apparently busy and couldn't answer. At first, Julia was worried, thinking something terrible and irreversible had happened to him. But soon she saw a recent performance of that band on a music channel. Gustavo was there with them, changed, more mature, even more serious than usual. So, he was fine, just apparently decided to start a new life and cut off all previous ties, including forgetting about her, Julia. At first, the girl still hoped, waited for him to call, to explain everything, but Gustavo disappeared, completely vanished from her life. Julia made it a rule to watch the music channel every day. Occasionally, she saw Gustavo. He was never the center of attention, but still sometimes caught on camera. And quite often, there was a girl with him, the same one, perhaps a makeup artist or costume designer for the band. Beautiful, striking. It seemed there was something between her and Gustavo, there had to be. Julia desperately envied Gustavo and this girl, and other potential muses of her beloved. She was in pain, a pain like never before, and also felt offended and scared. Scared of being alone again without the warmth and support of a loved one. A nasty mix of feelings and emotions, and there were other more pressing problems, a lack of money. Julia was barely making ends meet with her tiny salary and the loan. Eventually, the bar went bankrupt. New owners bought it, turned it into a hookah bar, and Julia had to quit, along with all the former staff. Another blow. This place held special memories and feelings for Julia, and now the bar was gone. The cozy bar where one could always enjoy live music, where a friendly and warm atmosphere prevailed. Gustavo would have understood her, supported her. With him, everything was simpler and more pleasant, but he was hundreds of kilometers away and, it seemed, had already forgotten about her. Gustavo had no idea of the desperate situation Julia was in. He never learned about the loan, thinking that Julia helped him with an additional amount she unexpectedly received, and of course, he had no idea about her job loss. And even if he knew, would it matter to him now? Julia didn't have the luxury to dwell on resentments and thoughts of what if. She desperately needed a job, preferably a well-paid one, and so she tirelessly scoured job listings, hoping to find something that could help her climb out of her financial pit. Fortunately, the owner agreed to wait for the rent payment, but his patience was limited. Soon, Julia might be asked to leave. A job advertisement caught Julia's attention due to the salary offered a decent amount that could solve many of her problems. But the job itself seemed unfamiliar to Julia. It required a caregiver for a small, apparently unwell girl. The diagnosis wasn't disclosed. However, the advertiser made it clear, the child needed round-the-clock care and supervision, including administering medication on time, accompanying her to procedures, and so on. Julia pondered. She had experience caring for little children, thanks to Angela and her brood. She even enjoyed taking care of her nieces and nephew. She knew how to feed, dress, and entertain small children. But this was about a seriously ill child. Could she handle it? At least it was worth trying. Julia called the provided number and was greeted by a pleasant male voice. He asked her a few questions: age, occupation, education, experience with small children. She was then invited for an interview. Julia was nervous the night before. She wanted this job. It was as vital as air for her, a chance to escape her financial hole, to stay afloat. Where else could she find such a salary? So she worried, fretted. What if they didn't hire her? Would she have to look for a waitress job again, working for mere pennies? A taxi brought Julia to a suburban cottage settlement, an elite area with high, beautiful houses surrounded by fences. At the gates, a housekeeping assistant greeted her, who, as Julia later learned, did everything: cleaning, cooking, laundry, because her employer, Victor Campos, was always too busy. Business people generally have very little free time. Senor Campos met the applicant in the living room. He was a man in his 40s, with intelligent, piercingly blue eyes. Perfectly styled hair with a touch of gray, an athletic figure. Clearly, this man paid attention to his health and appearance. Julia felt intimidated at first. How to start a conversation with such a person? Next to him, she suddenly felt insignificant. "Good morning," Senor Campos smiled warmly, and Julia's embarrassment vanished. His smile was open and kind. Senor Campos immediately seemed like a familiar person. "Hello," Julia smiled back. "I'm here about the job advertisement." "That's very good. Let me tell you straight away, I need a caregiver for my daughter. Sandra, she's in a very serious condition right now, so it's not for everyone. Her health is monitored by doctors. They come here every day. I could hire a nurse for Sandra, but how should I put this? Her life already involves a lot of pain, many people in white coats. I would like someone else to be with her. Someone young like you, cheerful, who knows many songs and fairy tales, who can entertain a child, inspire her, come up with some interesting activity. In short, to brighten her leisure time." What's wrong with your daughter? Julia simply couldn't help but ask this question. Who knows? Senor Campos lowered his eyes. His face instantly darkened, becoming anxious and tense. Sandra has been examined everywhere. No one can understand anything. Her body, it's like it's destroying itself. There are no signs of autoimmune aggression. She is constantly tested, they would have noticed, but she is fading away, and nothing helps. Poor little girl, exclaimed Julia. The doctors are doing what they can. I have the means, as you understand, but they are not omnipotent, unfortunately. In short, Sandra needs not just any nanny. For that, we have Sonora Espejo, our beloved housekeeper. She can feed her and give her medications on time. And we don't need just a caregiver either. Sandra is attended by nurses. They perform all the necessary procedures. What Sandra needs more is perhaps, well, a friend, someone who can bring her positive emotions. The doctors say that this is very important in her condition. And looking at you, it seems to me that you are just that, young, beautiful, cheerful, and you have a kind look. You can empathize, and that's good. Julia nodded. She already wanted to meet Sandra soon. If the little girl needs positive emotions, she will provide them. Julia will definitely cheer up the girl who has such a heavy illness, brighten up the gray everyday life of the little patient, and find a way to make her life more pleasant. If you are ready to start working right now, continued Senor Campos, then let's begin. A trial period, well, let's say, 3 days, and then Sandra will decide. Of course, you will get paid for your time anyway. Well, do you agree? Yes, Julia nodded. That's great, Senor Campos beamed. Then Senora Espejo will introduce you to Sandra, and I have to go, business. When the door closed behind Senor Campos, Senora Espejo, a middle-aged woman with an incredibly soft and cozy look, asked Julia, "Have you interacted with little children before? Do you know what little children are like?" "I have nieces and nephew," nodded Julia. "That's good," nodded Senora Espejo. "Just that our Sandra, she is not a usual child. You probably already figured it out. Sandra barely gets out of bed, gets tired quickly. It's hard to interest her in anything, but it's necessary. Sandra needs to be distracted from her pain, her suffering, and also she needs to walk at least an hour a day, as the doctors said." "I understand. Well, now let's go meet her." Julia followed Senora Espejo upstairs, entered the children's room. It was a spacious princess room. A huge window let in a lot of daylight, shelves lined with expensive toys and books stretched along the walls. Right in the center of the room was a mini playground. There were a slide, swings, even a trampoline. A little further away was a ball pool, and closer to the door was a bed. What a bed it was! Big, round, with a pink canopy. Julia looked around curiously. She had never seen such rooms before. Is all this for one child? Amongst this entire splendor, Julia did not immediately notice the small owner of the room. The girl was lying in bed surrounded by large soft toys. There was a cat, a fluffy white bear, a bright green crocodile with flowers all over its body, and a thin, pale 7-year-old girl, almost transparent and almost merging with the white bed linen due to her unhealthy skin color. Large blue eyes, like her father's, curiously looked at those who entered. Sandra propped herself up on her elbow, although it cost her a great effort, and turned to Senora Espejo. "And who's this with you? A new rehabilitator?" The complex words slipped easily and habitually from the little girl's lips, and it was somehow completely unnatural. "No, darling, this is your new friend. Her name is Julia. You'll play together." "With dolls?" Sandra perked up a little. "Whatever you want," Julia smiled at her. The girl evoked sympathy and pity. "I really love playing with dolls." "That's good. Vera is always too busy, and Dad doesn't know how to play at all." "Adults have a lot of things to do," Julia shrugged. "Sometimes they can be boring." Sandra guessed and smiled conspiratorially. "Boring," Julia agreed. Sandra chuckled quietly. "Well, I see everything will be fine between you two." Senora Espejo looked genuinely happy. "You have fun here, and I'll go cook lunch. Oh, and Sandra, remember, the nurse is coming today." "I remember," Sandra frowned. "Another 4 drip. Well, what can we do, dear?" Senora Espejo kissed the girl on the top of her head and left the room. Julia was left alone with Sandra. "Shall we play?" Julia smiled at her charge. "You have so many beautiful toys here, it's hard to choose." "Better read to me," the girl requested. It seemed the short conversation had drained her last bit of energy. Sandra lay back on the pillow, pulling the blanket over her thin body, even though the room was warm. "Okay," Julia agreed. She was amazed and horrified by the weakness of this child. 7-year-olds are usually bundles of energy. Like Yan, Julia's older nephew, Sandra's age, but you can't make him sit still for 5 minutes, always climbing somewhere, inventing something. Angelina calls him the perpetual motion machine. And Michaela and Carolina, younger than Yan, are just as active. But Sandra laid there, poor thing, flat out. "What would you like me to read?" "About princesses. The book is on the windowsill. Vera started reading it to me, but she never has time to finish. You continue." It was a heavy, beautifully illustrated book. But the story itself seemed silly, boring, predictable, and cliched to Julia. She never liked such fairy tales as a child. "How about, let's make up our own story about these princesses?" As Julia expected, interest sparkled in Sandra's tired eyes. How? She clarified. Very simple, I start, and you continue. The activity captivated Sandra. She inventively imagined adventures for the princess, racing in a car, being kidnapped by a dragon, and then rescued by a prince. The girl's imagination was bursting, which seemed to surprise Sandra herself. Then Senora Espejo entered the room and, seeing that Julia and Sandra got along, she was pleased. The woman brought lunch, cream soup, stewed vegetables. Sandra grimaced. I don't want it, she said. I don't want to eat it all, especially this. Senora Espejo looked at Julia, clearly expecting her help. Let me feed you, Julia addressed Sandra. Each spoonful another adventure of the princess. I'll make them up on the spot. Imagine how much I have to tell you. What do you think will end first, your food or my imagination? The reception worked. The food ran out faster than Julia's imagination, but Sandra demanded more stories. Senora Espejo raised her hands in surprise, smiled, and left. Soon, a nurse entered the children's room. Sandra immediately darkened. She was almost asleep, lunch and her story had tired her out, but it was time for the procedures. And for? The girl hopelessly asked the nurse, who nodded sympathetically. I'll do it quickly, don't be afraid. It won't hurt. You can sleep afterward. And we'll have coffee for now, Senora Espejo pulled Julia by the sleeve. You're not needed here right now. The housekeeper led Julia to the spacious kitchen. On the table, steaming cups of coffee and a fragrant pie were already waiting, which seemed to have just come out of the oven. It looks like you've gotten along well with Sandra, the woman smiled, looking warmly at Julia. That's good. Sandra chased away her previous nanny, but she took to you right away. I've already called Senor Campos, told him everything. He's very pleased and happy, ordered us to take good care of you. I'm glad too, Julia smiled. I feel really sorry for Sandra. My nephews are so noisy, so cheerful, and she's lying in bed and can't even play anything. It's so sad. What do the doctors say? Are there any chances? No predictions, Senora Espejo shook her head. They can't even give her a diagnosis. They're just alleviating the symptoms. After the 4, Sandra will feel a bit better for a while. You'll take a walk after her afternoon nap. Senor Campos is Sandra's father. I understood that. But where is her mother? Is she on a business trip? Does she also have a responsible job, which is why she can't stay with her daughter? Oh, if only, Senora Espejo sighed. Helena. She's not here. The birth was complicated. The doctors tried to save the child and didn't realize that the mother needed help too. And Helena herself didn't complain about anything, she was worried about the child, and then it turned out like this. The next day after giving birth, Helena's temperature shot up. Examinations, intensive care. And then, her heart stopped. Some internal bleeding had occurred in the poor girl. A rare case, and on top of that, Sandra was also in intensive care. She was born prematurely. It was a difficult time. How sad. Very sad, Senora Espejo agreed. Let me tell you the whole story. It seems you're here for a while, so you should be in the know. Victor grew up in a well-off and loving family, a loving mother and father, caring grandparents, his own room, trips to the seaside every summer, birthdays, friends. Victor had a happy childhood and an equally happy youth. He graduated from school with honors, thanks in large part to his parents, who cared deeply about his education. If they saw any gaps, they immediately hired the best tutors for Victor. And as for languages, the boy studied them in foreign camps. He had both relaxation and education at once. The vouchers to such places were not cheap, and getting them was not easy, but they did it all for their beloved son. Especially if he was such a long-awaited and cherished child. Victor's parents were quite old when they finally had a child. They had been childless for many years. The couple had resigned themselves to this fate, but then, when hope was almost gone, life suddenly threw them a surprise. They were blessed with a child. Needless to say that all the attention of the mother and father had belonged to Victor ever since. Victor never felt ashamed of his parents. Yes, he could see that his mother and father were much older than the parents of his classmates, but, on the contrary, the boy was proud of his name because Victor's father was a well-known businessman in the city, and his mother was the chief doctor of the regional hospital. Everyone knew them, and everyone respected them. It never crossed Victor's mind to be ashamed of his family. Victor grew up, his parents aged rapidly, they began to give up. When he was in his third year of university, his father passed away, a stroke, intensive care, coma, and that was it. Victor, for the first time in his life, felt like an adult. It was understandable because as a student, he had to delve into his father's business affairs, which his parent had left to him as an inheritance. No, Victor had been interested in his father's business since adolescence. He knew a lot, even had the power of signature, but still. For the time being, he entrusted most of the management processes to a colleague and a longtime friend of his late father because Victor needed to study and support his mother, who had deteriorated greatly after her husband's death. 3 years passed. Victor had just received his diploma, had just taken over his father's company, had just started gaining strength, and then came another blow. This time it was his mother. Victor was left all alone. He felt miserable and lonely in the large family home. Thankfully, Senora Espejo was there, the housekeeper and almost a family member. She had known Victor since he was a little boy and treated him as her own son. She didn't have any children of her own. All her care was dedicated to the young man who had lost both of his parents one after another. It was really tough for him. Senora Espejo shook her head. He was just a boy. And his work at the time was demanding. There were decisions to be made, places to go, meetings to attend, contracts to sign, and all sorts of things. That's what saved Victor back then. Time passed. Victor transformed from a young and inexperienced boy into a smart and savvy man, a talented businessman. Senora Espejo rejoiced in watching over her ward. He grew up, became stronger, gained self-confidence. The housekeeper hoped that Victor would find a good wife, get married, and become a father. That's when her heart would be at ease. But he didn't really have anyone special, Senora Espejo said. Sure, there were some girls around Victor. He's a prominent and wealthy young man. They were always after him. But it seemed to me that they were only interested in his money, just gold diggers. And then Helena came along. Victor literally bumped into Helena on the street. She was walking along the sidewalk, in a hurry, as it turned out, for a job interview at Victor's company. Helena had recently been laid off. The factory where she had worked as an accountant for several years after college suddenly closed down, so Helena was now looking for a new position. Victor had gone out for a walk, to get some fresh air. He even had a goal, to buy donuts at the bakery around the corner. And then fate brought the young people together, quite literally. Helena rushed out from around the corner and collided with the unsuspecting Victor. From that point on, everything unfolded like in a romantic music video. Helena's bag fell off her shoulder, its contents scattered on the asphalt. Victor and Helena rushed to pick it all up. The girl was apologizing frantically, and Victor assured her that everything was fine while admiring her beautiful gray eyes. It was love at first sight. When the young couple sorted out the bag and the items that had spilled from it, they both stood up simultaneously, smiled at each other, and Victor, as a man, took the first step, asked the name of the beautiful stranger, and then introduced himself. They walked slowly and talked, getting to know each other. When Victor learned that Helena was rushing to his office, he brightened up and immediately understood that this beautiful girl was his destiny. And it was not accidental that they met in such an interesting way, rather than seeing each other for the first time in the office. It was more romantic, interesting, and pleasant that way. In general, a real romance began. Senora Espejo had never seen Victor so happy. Helena turned out to be smart, understanding, and kind. She quickly found common ground with Sonora Espejo, which was important. Sweet, sweet girl. Why does she have such a fate? Sonora Espejo shook her head in dismay. A couple of years after they met, Victor and Helena got married. They were a wonderful, harmonious, and happy couple. Love, understanding, and respect reigned between them. Sonora Espejo's heart rejoiced when she saw them together, her beloved Vico and his wonderful, beautiful wife. Well, they decided not to rush with children. Sonora Espejo continued her story. It was their joint decision, as if they felt something. They traveled, worked, and spent time with friends. And I, being a fool, advised them in an old-fashioned way not to delay with this matter. I wanted to spoil their little one. But Victor and Helena lived for themselves for a long time, a whole 5 years after their wedding. They wanted children, but not right away, later. Everything was fine with them as it was. And then came the news of Helena's pregnancy. It was an unplanned event, but all the household members greeted it with joy. Well, it's time, Helena summed it up. The child decided that waiting was no longer necessary. Thank God. Sonora Espejo clapped her hands. I think you'll have a boy. Helena, you've become so beautiful. Girls take away their mother's beauty during pregnancy. But the housekeeper was mistaken. The ultrasound confirmed that Helena was expecting a healthy, strong girl. They showed me her ultrasound picture. You know, they're doing this type of photos right in mother's womb. I looked at it, and she looked just like Helena. That's how our Sandra was born, resembling her mommy. Sandra. It was Helena who chose the name for their daughter. Victor and Sonora Espejo had no objections. They both liked it. Helena's pregnancy was not easy. At first, she suffered from morning sickness, and then it seemed to subside, but other problems arose: high blood pressure and swelling. The baby was developing well, but her mother was suffering, wasting away before their eyes, refusing to eat, and spending a lot of time lying down. The usually energetic Helena lacked the strength even to go downstairs. Sonora Espejo brought her food to her bedroom. The woman pitied Helena, helped her as much as she could, and assured her that everything would be fine after the birth. It's not easy for women to have children, Sonora Espejo sighed. It depends, Julia shrugged, remembering her sister. For her, having children had been relatively easy. In general, Helena's labor began much earlier than expected. The pregnancy had been threatened throughout, so fortunately, at that moment, the expectant mother was in the hospital under the supervision of doctors. They tried to stop the process, but it didn't work. Sandra was born prematurely, weak. She didn't cry, and they didn't place her on Helena's chest. They didn't even show her to her mother. When it comes to newborns who need to stay in their mother's womb for at least 3 more months, everything happens differently. Sandra was immediately sent to the intensive care unit, and a battle for her life began. As for Helena, initially, it seemed like everything was fine with Helena. She was tired, of course, after giving birth, and she worried about her daughter, couldn't find her place. All of this was understandable, explainable, and natural. Doctors examined the new mother, found no deviations, and sent her to the hospital room. Serious symptoms appeared later, but it was too late. Victor and I were both so worried about the baby, Sonora Espejo almost cried. It was clear that even now, 7 years later, it was difficult for her to recall everything. We thought the baby wouldn't survive. She was born too early, too weak. And then, when Victor received a call from the hospital in the morning and was informed that his wife had died from internal bleeding, he didn't believe his ears at first. He thought they were talking about Sandra. His mind refused to accept what he had heard. But no, Sandra had managed to pull through. She turned out to be a strong girl, but Helena, she was gone. Victor was like a ghost for several months. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. I thought he might. You know. But he pulled through. He had to work, he had to take care of Sandra. Although, To be completely honest, at first, he treated his daughter poorly, blamed her for what happened to Helena. He understood that it wasn't right, but he couldn't help being angry with her. Sandra was discharged from the hospital. They hired a nanny for her because someone had to take care of the baby. Sonora Espejo was already too old for this, but she enjoyed playing with Sandra, pushing her in the stroller around the yard, talking to her a lot, and she was the only one who gave the newborn the much-needed love. During that period, the father was not capable of it. "She's like a granddaughter to me," the housekeeper smiled. "I accepted her right away, but Victor..." He kept his distance from the child for a long time. He bought everything she needed, sometimes took her for a walk, but only if I insisted. He didn't take any initiative. And then, one day, Sandra got sick. Her temperature shot up, and nothing helped. She was vomiting. It was a severe flu that was going around at the time, and it hit many people hard, especially the little ones. Well, in short, Sandra ended up in the hospital again. The doctors didn't give any predictions, and that's when Victor came to his senses. He dropped everything, sat by his daughter's bedside for days, sang songs to her, recited poems, rocked her in his arms. And Sandra, it was as if she felt her father's care. She immediately started getting better. They discharged our little one, and Victor became a completely different person with her, a real loving and caring father. Life went on. Victor worked a lot, but always found time to spend with his daughter. Sandra grew up, brought joy to her father and Sonora Espejo with excellent health and rare intelligence. Everything seemed fine, except Sonora Espejo worried about the fact that Victor remained alone. She felt that he wouldn't find happiness until he met a woman. However, now it was a very complicated task. Victor's chosen one had to love and accept Sandra, or there could be no union. But God heard my prayers, Sonora Espejo smiled, and Victor met Leonora. A beauty, you couldn't take your eyes off her. And she's smart too. She has a child of her own, a daughter a little younger than Sandra. They formed a wonderful family. Leonora got a job at Victor's company, and everything started at some corporate event of theirs. In short, it's a common story. Leonora treated Sandra well. She often took both her and her younger daughter somewhere, to the amusement park, to the movies. Sandra grew to love both Leonora and her younger stepsister Alda. She was genuinely happy. Victor and Leonora got married, started living together, and then, that's when Sandra's symptoms began. It started with dizziness, then nausea, weakness, loss of appetite. Examinations at the best clinics, trips to doctors abroad, consultations with renowned professors, none of it yielded any results. Doctors couldn't make a correct diagnosis, and the girl was fading before their eyes. She was fine for the first year. Sonora Espejo almost cried again. It was evident that her heart genuinely ached for the little girl. But after New Year, she got worse, very bad now. I'm so worried about her. And it's unclear what kind of illness has attacked our little one. Leonora temporarily moved with her daughter to her own apartment. Alda went to daycare and brought back infections, which posed a significant risk to Sandra. So, Leonora and Victor made this decision. No, Leonora often comes, almost every day. She's doing great. She visits Sandra, brings her little gifts. Sometimes she brings Alda, too, when she's not sick with anything. But once she started going to daycare, it all began, one sick leave after another. So that's how it is for them, the wife with one child at one place, the husband with the elder daughter at another. That's their family. But what can you do? It's the situation. It's still a strange situation, Julia remarked. The story of Victor and Sandra had left her shaken. It's like a TV series. Well, it is what it is, the elderly woman shrugged. You seem to have gotten along with Sandra. That's good. She'll be happier with you. Days passed by. Julia now lived in a room next to Sandra's, but the girl often asked the nanny to stay overnight in her room. There was a very comfortable sofa there. They talked before bedtime, held hands. Julia could see that it was very important for Sandra. The girl clearly lacked attention despite having many adults around her. Victor was a very caring and concerned father and a pleasant person to talk to. They often talked about Sandra. The man always listened attentively to Julia, didn't interrupt her, didn't argue, and asked the right questions. Julia also got to know Leonora. Sonora Espejo was right, she was indeed a very beautiful woman. Sharp cheekbones, beautifully curved lips, graceful as a panther. A real queen. But when Leonora interacted with Sandra, when she adjusted the girl's blanket, smiled at her, caressed the child's head, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was insincere. It manifested itself in insignificant, seemingly trivial details, the cold gleam in her eyes, the disdainful movement of her lips, something imperceptible yet very unpleasant. One day, Julia had a strange dream. She found herself in a room, peeling wallpaper, creaky floors. She sat on a rickety stool near a dark window through which nothing could be seen, and she realized that she was asleep. She wanted to wake up desperately, but for some reason, it wouldn't happen. And then, Julia didn't even understand where she came from. Before her, Helena seemed to materialize out of thin air. Julia recognized her because she had seen pictures of Sandra's mother. Helena sadly smiled and looked at Julia with a warm and very gentle gaze. "Watch over her," she said in a soft, melodic voice. "Watch over Leonora. She's the source of all the trouble, she's dangerous." Having said this, Helena dissolved into thin air. And Julia wanted to ask her so many questions: how to watch over her, why, what makes her dangerous. Julia woke up drenched in cold sweat. Or rather, it felt like she had flown into her own body, fallen into it. A strange sensation. The words of Helena still echoed in her head. No, Julia didn't believe in the supernatural, but the dream, which hardly resembled a dream at all, seemed more like a journey through time and worlds. The strange dream wouldn't let go. The next day, Leonora wasn't there, and Julia was waiting for her. She knew for sure that this woman was involved in something unpleasant. Leonora, somehow, was harming this family and didn't love Sandra. She lacked sympathy for the girl, pretending to care. And how could the others not notice this? Even the experienced Sonora Espejo. Leonora appeared the next day, as usual, beautiful, brightly made up, languid. She went to greet Sandra first, then went down to the kitchen. "Sandra wants something to drink," Leonora said, looking at Sonora Espejo. "How about I make her some cocoa?" "Let me do it," the household assistant bustled about. "No, I can handle it. I want to do something for her." "You're so caring." Julia stayed silent. She watched Leonora, as she had been told by Helena in that dream. For some reason, it felt like this was an important moment, as if Helena were nearby, guiding her to be vigilant. Sonora Espejo was busy with the dough, and Julia pretended to look out the window, but she was watching Leonora, and there it was. The woman skillfully pulled a small vial from her sleeve, dropped a few drops into the milk, and then quickly concealed the bottle. It all took just a couple of seconds, a few swift movements, but Julia saw it all. "The drink for the princess is ready," Leonora smiled. "Julia, could you pass me your favorite cup, please?" Julia complied. She remained silent, watching as Leonora poured the cocoa into Sandra's cup, featuring the characters from the girl's favorite cartoon, and realizing that Sandra shouldn't drink it, she shouldn't. She needed to take action. Julia pretended to slip and stumbled into Leonora. The woman dropped the cup from her hands. The glass fell and shattered, and the cocoa spilled all over the floor. "I'm so sorry, I'm so clumsy." Julia hurriedly started cleaning up the spilled mess, picking up the pieces. "It's okay, I'll make another one." There was a poorly concealed irritation in Leonora's voice. Julia couldn't pull off the same trick a second time, as it would raise suspicion. So, she had to accept that Sandra would drink the cocoa made by her stepmother. While Leonora and Sonora Espejo were with Sandra, Julia squeezed the cloth she had used to clean the cocoa into an empty tomato paste jar. She planned to take the liquid to be analyzed right away. She needed to know for sure what Leonora had added to the cocoa. It might have been ordinary vitamins, and in that case, there was no need to panic. But something told Julia that it wasn't. The results of the analysis took 2 days to come back. When Julia saw the report, she was horrified. The drink contained a deadly poison, causing symptoms similar to those Sandra had experienced. This meant that the girl's weakness was explained by the fact that her stepmother was systematically poisoning her, as if in a grim fairy tale. Julia didn't know who to turn to with this information. Sonora Espejo? But what could she do? Victor? He might not believe her at all. What should she do? Leonora couldn't be allowed near the girl anymore. She wanted to send her to the other side and had nearly succeeded in her endeavor. And yet, Julia, mustering her courage, spoke to Victor, telling him everything about her strange dream, the cocoa incident, and the forensic analysis. Julia was afraid that he would yell at her, insult her, fire her, or worse, accuse her of trying to harm his daughter. "You know," Victor said, examining Julia, "I would. I probably would have fired you immediately after hearing these words. It's very strange, you must agree. But just yesterday I also had an unusual dream. Helena. She asked me to trust you, just to trust you, nothing more. Let's not tell anyone about this for now, and take some time off. I need to sort everything out. Sonora Espejo will call you when you can come back to work." Julia spent these few days on edge. She didn't know what was happening in Victor's house, and she was very worried about Sandra, to whom she had already grown attached with all her heart. But Victor told her to wait for a call, so she waited. Sonora Espejo called. Seeing her name on the screen, Julia became anxious. What would they tell her now? How did everything go? "Come over," Sonora Espejo said. "We have something here. Come quickly. Sandra misses you a lot." Julia didn't need much persuading. Within half an hour, she was already at Victor's house. The door was opened by the owner himself, still calm and composed. From his appearance, it was hard to guess what had happened. "I want to thank you," the man finally allowed himself to smile. "You were right. Leonora, she really wanted. I'm almost afraid to say it out loud. That wretch wanted to poison Sandra." Sonora Espejo didn't mince her words. "Can you imagine? I trusted her so much." The story turned out to be banal and as old as the world. Greedy Leonora couldn't accept the presence of a rival in the form of Victor's beloved daughter in her life of luxury. She wanted Victor's entire fortune to go to her own daughter, Alda, instead. Well, to herself first, of course. Leonora had once studied to become a pharmacist. Although she had never worked in that profession and had preferred to live off wealthy admirers, she had acquired enough knowledge in college to come up with a way to send her detested stepdaughter to the other side. A poison that was difficult to detect in the blood and tissues unless specifically looked for. Leonora added the toxic substance to the food she prepared for Sandra, and the girl grew weaker, slowly fading away. The goal was within reach. "This is unfathomable, beyond belief." Sonora Espejo couldn't calm down. Julia understood her. Indeed, Leonora's act was monstrous. How could she do this to an innocent child? Sandra had believed in her, loved her. In the end, Victor installed surveillance cameras in the kitchen. It turned out that Leonora added poison to Sandra's food every time. Sometimes she cooked something for the girl herself, sometimes she cleverly dropped it into the products prepared by Sonora Espejo. "I personally carried this poison to Sandra with my own hands." In the end, Leonora was caught red-handed. She was currently under investigation. Sandra's father took her back, a man who had longed to be with his child for a long time but was rejected because he was deemed unworthy due to his poverty. "Alda will be fine," reassured Sonora Espejo. "The child is not to blame for what her mother wanted to do." "And Sandra? How is she?" A clear voice came from behind. "Sandra is great." Julia turned around and locked eyes with Sandra. She was still very thin and pale, but she had enough strength now to walk around the house. A real miracle. The doctor said she would recover quickly. Julia and Gustavo strolled slowly along the shelves of the children's store. It was the girls' section, so both of them felt like they had entered a realm of pink and purple. Dolls, sets of children's cosmetics, soft toys. Their eyes were wide with wonder. When I was in the USA, a guy bought a voice-controlled robot for his nephew. That's something. Maybe Sandra will like something similar. She's a girl, Julia reminded him. She definitely wants a doll, a character from a cartoon. We need to try to find one. Maybe on her next birthday, she won't want toys at all. Children grow up so fast. It's amazing. We'll find out soon enough. Gustavo placed his hand on Julia's rounded belly. The baby responded immediately with a weak but noticeable kick. A year ago, right after they saved Sandra from her wicked stepmother, Julia had another surprise waiting for her. She continued to live with Sandra nearby. The little girl was quickly recovering, engaging in active play, and asking to be taken on walks all around the city. The girl remained very attached to Julia. She still needed work, and she had become accustomed to everyone, the girl, Senora Espejo, and even Senor Campos. She didn't want to part with them. Initially, the adults decided not to tell Sandra the truth about what had happened to her. The story was too dreadful. But the clever girl managed to put two and two together, overheard something, and figured things out on her own. This story didn't have as devastating effect on her as the adults had feared. Sandra took it all rather calmly. It's just like in fairy tales, the girl shrugged. The little one was coming back to life. In September, she started school with her peers. As for Julia was finally able to resume her studies at the university. She chose a part-time program because she needed to both study and work. However, her work now resembled life in a family with her loved ones. Sweet, cheerful Sandra, kind and wise Senora Espejo, the always busy but polite and attentive Senor Campos. With these people, Julia felt comfortable, warm, and content. They accepted her, and they were very grateful to her for saving Sandra. It's scary to think about what could have happened if it weren't for that strange dream. They discussed this unusual event. First, Helena appeared in Julia's dream, and then in Victor's. Senora Espejo was convinced that Helena had broken through time and worlds to save her daughter. Victor just shook his head and didn't express his opinion, while Julia, she didn't know what to think. Perhaps Leonora immediately aroused her suspicion because Sandra's stepmother didn't make a good impression on her from the first glance. More likely, Julia was turning things over in her mind. It's possible that her thoughts transformed into this unusual dream. But what was harder to explain was that Helena appeared in Victor's dream too and asked him to trust Julia. That was more difficult to understand. On that day, Julia left the house alone. Sandra was studying. Senora Espejo was busy with household chores. Julia needed to go to the university to submit some documents to the dean's office. And suddenly, Gustavo stepped towards her. Julia couldn't believe her eyes. She stepped back, but he looked happy and bewildered. He smiled and looked at Julia as if there was no one more important to him in the world. "I finally found you," he said, unable to contain himself, and hugged her. Julia didn't understand anything, but she didn't resist. She pressed herself against her beloved, relishing his closeness and trying not to think about Gustavo's betrayal, his sudden disappearance. The explanation turned out to be ridiculously simple. Gustavo had simply dropped his phone into the ocean while on a boat trip. Naturally, the gadget was irretrievably lost. Julia wasn't registered on social networks, so he couldn't contact her in any way. Gustavo wrote letters, like in the old days, letters and telegrams, but Julia, she had moved in with Victor, and she rarely came home, so the letters piled up in the mailbox, and then, for some reason, they disappeared. Julia remembered that moment. Somehow, she returned home and saw that the mailbox door was broken. Someone had for some reason broken into the mailbox and taken the letters. Maybe kids, maybe a curious neighbor? In short, Julia didn't receive any news from Gustavo, so she thought he had forgotten about her, started a new life, and betrayed her. I couldn't just drop everything and leave. It concerned my career and our future, our well-being. Without you, without news about you, it was unbearable, but I knew I had to wait, and then, financially, I would secure us for many years ahead, and then I could come to you and explain everything. I didn't even realize how difficult it was for you. That's how it was, just an unfortunate series of events. Julia was happy that her feelings and Gustavo's turned out to be real, that there was no betrayal or deception in her life. Just a misunderstanding that had finally been resolved. Gustavo now had a contract with a famous producer in the capital. He had everything he had dreamed of: concerts, performances, tours, the opportunity to bring his music to people who were ready to accept it, and of course, money. Gustavo even managed to buy an apartment for the two of them. Right now, renovations were in full swing there. Gustavo and Julia got married. They were already expecting a child. Julia felt happy and loved. She no longer worked for Victor, and the now stronger and more mature Sandra no longer needed a round-the-clock nanny. But they all remained friends. And right now, Julia and Gustavo were choosing a gift for Sandra on her 9th birthday, which might never have happened.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.